and welcome to another episode of the All Words Are Free podcast. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the ways in which we speak and the link of that to one's intellect. So this is quite a dense topic per se. There's a lot to say, and there's a lot that I can say from my own position, whether that be personal experience or from my background. There is so much to be said on this topic, to the point where this is probably the episode so far that has the most notes. I have a double-page spread in my notebook dedicated to each episode idea. And this one, I can tell you, I've got my double-page spread and then about 6 post-its or so, double-sided. This is a big one. This is going to be a dense one. And the title of this episode is Like, and the Class Divide, How We Speak and the Link to Intellect. Okay, so before we begin, as is mandatory, I'm going to do an outfit of the day. So I can't exactly say that there's anything exciting. So I don't think I'm going to put a picture on this time. But I'm just wearing some, you've got to keep it real. I'm not busting out an outfit every day. I'm just wearing some black or dark grey joggers, kind of slack, very comfortable, slightly oversized, an orange top, just like a strappy top, sort of triangular shaped over the bust. Really nice, comfortable. And I'm wearing a white cardigan because it's cozy. And then my usual jewellery, because I like wearing jewellery all the time. It doesn't matter if I'm dressed up or not. The jewellery is present. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I think, apologies if my words are all jumbled and bumbled. So there's a perfect opportunity to record today because both of my flatmates are out. And I get kind of a bit, not anxious, but like I get a bit self-conscious if they can overhear me, especially since I'm going to speak quite loudly and going to project my voice, so it picks up well and everything. So I definitely want to take the opportunity to record like very openly, open to mistakes, because there are a lot of mistakes, which we will actually get into in this episode. But yes, I've been feeling so tired recently. It's actually insane. I've been doing an internship, so it makes sense that I'm getting tired. And I tend to have a couple of days every so often where I really, really struggle to do anything, and I feel really sort of low and sluggish, and my mind just isn't with it. And I also, I don't get really excited by things. I don't generally feel great in myself. So the past couple of days, I definitely had that period a few days ago. I felt really, really just a bit done, to be honest, a bit done with everything. I was kind of like, you know what, guys, it's not the one. But I definitely feel better in myself. I can always tell when I feel better in myself just by how I speak, how I interact with people, how energized I feel generally. But I think I've come down with a cold, or I've caught something, because my head feels so muggy. And you get out of bed and your throat's really sore. It feels like you have a right frog in your throat. And so while, let's say, personality-wise or communication-wise or ideas or thoughts-wise, I'm with it mentally, or like because of this headache, and because I feel so tired, I'm not quite with it, and that makes it quite frustrating. I actually published a piece today, the day I'm recording, called Uninspired Writer, and it's very true. It's like you have those days where you could feasibly, your mind is in it, and you could write you could write a lot of, say for example, a bit more of my novel, or you could really polish a piece off that you want to get out there, which I do. There's a piece I've called Behind the Lens about celebrity, or the concept of celebrity, and whether we can separate a person, an artist, as a person from their work, and whether those things are truly separable or whether they're too intertwined when it comes to things like negative things they've done, where they've said something, and whether you can separate the artist from their work, and whether you can still enjoy their work even though they have this stain in their career. So I won't go into that now because that is the subject of the article. However, it's been sitting there for a while because I just can't, I felt so inspired for it, and now the inspiration's just gone. I just the past few days I've really, really struggled. I read through it. I spent like an hour reading through it, or maybe not quite an hour, about half an hour, 45 minutes reading through it, and then I finished going through it and just thought I did not take in a word of that, because my head feels so muggy and I think it's this cold. And I hate colds because they just get in the way of me doing stuff I want to do. So that's kind of where I'm at. But I'm hoping with regular breaks and a nice matcha, I can get through this episode coherently. We'll try. But here we go. In a rogue misstep from the usual, there are a couple of quotes that link to the topics of today's video. They're both actually from the same paper that I read regarding this subject. But the two quotes are, language is a social product and a social tool, and the long recognised link between social change and linguistic change. So they're very interlinked in what they say, but the overall message perhaps is that language is not just the overt mode of communication. It's not just the outer level of one person speaking to the other, but rather it has an underbelly of connotations that maybe we don't even consciously think of. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So to begin with, it's almost a confession, but when I'm editing my podcasts, I tend to cut out any time I say or but yeah. I say but yeah a lot. It's kind of a verbal tick. Or like, especially for my generation, likes become very much a fixed part of any sentence we say. Like tends to come up a lot in casual conversation, and I always go back and cut it out. Any verbalization of thinking or of being uncertain, let's say, an expression of uncertainty, like an or an or an they're cut out. Because why? Does that make me sound more valid? Does that give my argument more strength? Does that fortify my judgment or make me sound more convincing? And I just find it very interesting to think that my words themselves and my arguments themselves, the value of them as an entity does not change whether I insert a like or not. But whether my voice sounds more convincing or my speech sounds more coherent because I take them out, is this an inherent truth or is this a bias? And what can class something as a truth? Because if it's ultimately human opinion that something sounds more intelligent or more valid than something else, does it become so disseminated in society that it does almost become a form of truth? Having a like or even a dialectal difference or certain vernacular does not alter the intelligence behind one's words. However, it's quite a prevalent thing through society that perhaps when you hear somebody say like, or somebody saying or a lot, for example. A lot of the times I do say a lot when I'm listening back to my podcast. It becomes a ranking metric for who's the more intelligent. And this doesn't take into account different dialects and just different ways of speaking, perhaps based on your background, which we'll all get into in a little bit. But another thing I wanted to raise about my podcast in particular is my accent. I obviously can't change my accent, but I have nothing against my accent at all. I don't feel the need to change it. I don't feel the need to say, put on what one would call a standard English accent, and we'll get into everything about standardised English soon. But there is that question of validity and believability. Because ultimately, due to the standardisation of English, the standard way of speaking has become that which characterises the middle and the middle upper and the upper classes of white England. It's the language and the accent of the bureaucracy, of the highly educated white male. And through this standardisation, everything else, everything that varies from that, or everything that veers from that, becomes lesser. So with my northern accent, is there an element of being taken less seriously than if somebody else with a southern accent, per se, was saying the same thing? But also, I very much appreciate that me sounding northern is one of the lowest, or sort of the most least prevalent boundaries that there can be as far as language goes. The way in which one speaks, or is it almost like, due to the accent you have, the way in which you speak, you almost try harder, or sort of take this factor into account, and therefore try and compensate for your accent with careful attention to grammar or your speech in another way, how you express yourself. And what does make a certain way of speaking more intellectual or worthy anyway? I can tell right now, and I can actively think about it, and still my voice won't change, that how I'm speaking now is the presentation version of my voice. And everyone has their own different versions of their voice. When you're on the phone and your voice goes up an octave, that tends to be the case for women, or a lot of women. It's almost linking to a sort of innocence or shyness, maybe more amiable because your voice has gone up, more feminine. And then men, and how their voices may go lower because that's seen as the desirable thing for them. And ultimately, when you can't be seen and you're on the phone and the only thing there is your voice, that's all anyone gets of you. That's all anyone's opinion of you can be formulated on. And so it's interesting how we perhaps conjure an image in our minds of a person from just their voice and draft up an expectation or a presumption just from the way they speak to us over the phone and how we respond to that as the speaker. But I'm speaking more in my presentation voice. I enunciate more, definitely, and I say my T's a lot more, and I actually emphasise them as well, which is quite funny. I think my voice did this when I used to go to poetry events and deliver poetry as well, because it's clearer, perhaps. But that was even in a group where we were all from the same place. So I don't know, it's very interesting. But my voice definitely changes when I'm around people I'm more comfortable with as well. I feel like my voice is perhaps more relaxed when I'm with certain people, and perhaps the subconscious focus on or subconscious care towards a particular way of speaking, or that care for proper enunciation, drops or changes, because ultimately it becomes unnecessary when I'm with people who feel fully comfortable with. I don't know, it's very, very interesting, and this is just scratching the surface. So here we go. Enter stage left standardization. In her video essay on linguistic discrimination, which is linked below, Shanspeare, who I think is wonderful, amazing videos, speaks on the standardization of English and AAVE, or African American Vernacular English. So AAVE is a way of speaking that has quite a long history. It's a dialect that has quite a long history. However, over time, so in the past, during the initial standardization of English, the upper class white way of speaking was prioritised, and this became the language that was then infused into educational systems, governmental systems, all the different facets of life that ultimately have an overwhelming reach over a community or over the people of a country per se. And so things like AAVE, they become frowned upon because they don't meet this fairly inane standard. The standard has been set by people, so it's not an absolute. However, this ultimately leads to the categorization of the ways of speaking, and AAVE is automatically being seen as quote-unquote less educated, even though the thoughts that it may express, or the people speaking with AAVE may express, are not any less intellectual than somebody speaking in the standardized way. A key example of AAVE is saying ax instead of ask. Ask being the standard and ax being the AAVE. And that is a way that, as Shanspeare notes, that many people have spoken all their lives. It's their community, and if anything, negating that or taking it away and making people speak the standard, it dilutes the closeness or the solidarity one may feel within a given community, because you all speak in the same way or all understand each other in a similar way. It's the same way as having little in-jokes. You have your group who understand these little things that you say, or see recognition or familiarity in the ways in which one speaks that brings one comfort, almost. And a little bit later we'll come back to this in the idea of the working classes. The dissemination of this way of speaking leads to a general standardization, which is arbitrary. However, it's infused throughout our world, in books, in film, on the radio, in podcasts. The standard version of English is something that seems to be aspired to and people don't really know why. So you may aspire to come across as intelligent, or you may aspire to just portray your thoughts clearly, and one automatically tries to use the better grammar or speak more properly, but also with better grammar. Something can still be sensical and have correct grammar while not following the rules of standard English. So it's just interesting to follow this route and see maybe how far internally that bias goes, because the bias can be quite inherent, especially when you're brought up seeing standard English everywhere, and therefore anything that differs from that is unusual or not the norm. Another point I wanted to raise, though, is that standardized English is commonly associated with the South. The South being a very general term, of course, but in southern England. But note the negative connotations of that. Standardized English in its written form is, as I've already said to be the absolute, the most superior, the best way in which one can speak. The voice associated with it being the voice of, say, the upper class white person, this very properly spoken and commonly southern accent. There are a lot of negative connotations attached to that, and that is ultimately a form of stereotyping. I just thought it quite interesting to raise that, because I suppose it's almost that idea of subverting the stereotype, right? You're sort of pushing back against those who've previously stereotyped everyone else, per se. Not the people as individuals, but just as a general rule. But it's interesting to fighting back against stereotypes, or just the idea that all voices are going to be stereotyped anyway. All people, no matter their personhood or no matter their background or anything, there are stereotypes attached to everything. And so it's quite interesting when you look at the complexity of a human being and sort of dissect your own bias. I think looking inward and dissecting your own bias is a big thing. This is going slightly off topic, but a thing that Khadija Bow said, another video essayist, was that you're not responsible for your first thoughts. So you may see someone or hear someone and have an instant thought based on what they look like or what they sound like. However, you're not responsible for that first thought. You may have that deeply ingrained bias towards something that you may not truly believe. So for going back to AAVE, you may be speaking with someone and they say something that isn't that standard English, and that makes you think, oh, maybe makes you step back, maybe makes you think, oh, well, are they as credible as I thought they were on this topic? Say you're just debating something. But your second thought, you are, as Khadija says, you are responsible for your second thought. So you look back and think, no, why? That's not right, because they are completely credible in what they're saying, and they're speaking very articulately, and they're expressing their views. How they express those views, the words that they string together to express those views, doesn't take away from the fact that those views are still their own, and those views are still valid or articulated or educated or anything like that, or even true. I thought that was an intriguing point, and I think that's a good point to raise in any case, whether it's a discussion of fitness, whether it's a discussion of beauty standards, whether it's a discussion of ableism or racism or misogyny that's deeply ingrained in us. I don't think one should be afraid to challenge their own subconscious bias. And by having this, you're not responsible for your first thought because you have been indoctrinated with what society wants you to think, but rather you are responsible for your second thought, in that you then challenge that. You actively challenge your own thoughts. Don't be afraid to confront your own biases. Also slightly veering away from language itself, but looking more at intellectualism and elitism, is a conversation of highbrow versus lowbrow content. So in her discussion on linguistic discrimination, Shanspeare raises this point, and also Mainolay has spoken on this. The high versus low brow term originates from phrenology, which, as we know, is a debunked science, but essentially based one's ranking or a certain group's ranking in the overall one, or I don't know, like ranking of humans as superior to inferior based on the sort of shape of their skull. And the intellect was very tightly linked to the shape of your head or the shape of your skull, particular areas of the brain being more prominent, or particular shapes of skull per se were linked to particular areas of the brain being more prominent, and therefore a group or one being more inclined to a particular way of acting, of being, of a particular character. So, naturally, this was used to reinforce colonialism and all of the different things that involve racial bias, which is horrific and henceforth is not remotely true at all. But overall, the terms high versus lowbrow have persisted. So highbrow, we're talking things like opera and classical literature, very much associated with a desired aesthetic and the beauty of intellect, or intellectual beauty. It's all very heightened and given a superior gleam. It's seen as they're seen as superior art forms. Whereas lowbrow, while not necessarily frowned upon, are seen as lower forms of entertainment. The idea that one tends to aspire to being the person who listens to classical music because that makes one seem more intelligent or more intellectually inclined, which is very interesting. But it was interesting that in the conversation that she raises, Shanspeare mentions the idea that there is a need for the lowbrow stuff, and there is. I mean, ultimately, if you don't have lowbrow, then there is no highbrow. So that there is quite literally a need for it. But also, yeah, it's gazed upon as the necessary lower for the recognition of the higher, and indeed the relative power of those who enjoy the higher. The idea that lowbrow has a much wider audience or a much wider reach. And in that way, does that not make it the art form of the people, the art form of community, because everyone can enjoy it just as equally? Whereas the highbrow stuff, while also of value, is inaccessible, and therefore it's exclusive and it's elite. That isolates it somewhat from certain people and doesn't allow them to enjoy particular things. And perhaps opening things up to more is the whole idea of art in the first place. This leads on to the conversation of class. So class, in the general sense of the term, by definition, is a socioeconomic status. So class as a social construct is a way of quite literally classifying people into given groups or denominations. So in a general sense, you have the lower class, the working class, the middle class, and the upper class. There are, of course, nuances to this. There are breakaway groups and there are groups within groups. However, it's interesting to consider all of the different layers of this and the intertwining with the language. So an academic paper that I have been reading very recently, actually, which is linked below, discusses these concepts. And it was quite interesting to look at perhaps the temporal setting of class versus language. Which one comes first? Which one comes first, guys? Is it one's class that then influences the way they speak, which of course it will be in the way of birth, and therefore your surroundings will obviously directly influence the way in which you speak. But also, it was really interesting because it looked at the idea of, okay, well, let's subvert this slightly. What if you think of it the other way around? What if the way in which one speaks then has direct influence on how they are classed or how they are classified? And in which case both can be true simultaneously, because classification doesn't just have to be socioeconomic, as is the general sense of the term class. So it's all very intriguing and all very mixed up, and so class is going to be the general topic of the rest of this episode. So to begin with, this all links back to the geographical side of language division. The idea of the north and the south, or even areas within a particular area, such as the splitting of New York into different people with different dialects, different groups who speak in different ways. And it's very interesting how language is so closely linked to class, and language is also so closely linked to geography, and how all of these three concepts interlinked as a whole. In the paper that I read, it's very interesting, the concept of distinct versus gradual or continuous differences in the way in which people speak. So distinct boundaries can be seen very clearly in a city like New York, where, because it's separated into all its different fractions, the ways in which people speak are very distinct in themselves, as in they're not distinct to the point where they're not necessarily speaking the same language, but they're distinct to the point where there are things that they say that the other group would never say, like certain phrases or just certain ways of expressing themselves. The sounds as well. So the certain vowel sounds or consonant sounds or particular phrases that are spoken that sound very different and yet are quite literally the same words as if they were written down. And this idea of written English versus spoken English, that also has a massive impact. Written English is much more standardised on a greater scale and on a further scale than spoken English, especially when it comes to accents, but also in the realm of dialects. More continuous differences are things like pronunciation, are slight changes in, for example, dropping a T off the end of certain words. So instead of saying that, you say that. Or instead of saying my, some people may say ma, and then some people may say me, and then some people may say me. And then different groups, so for example, throughout England, will say different things based on where they are based and based on their geography. And because of the density of the population in particular areas, so for example a city, it may be more infused and continuous, but it also may be more isolated perhaps in a more remote area. Of course, now there is also the influence of the web, online, social media. We are constantly exposed to different ways of speaking and also to different manners of thought. And by constant exposure to different accents, different dialects, different groups, of course, your feed is reinforced by your searches. However, there is that greater level exposure to all different ways of speaking and all different ways of formulating language. And so that directly has an effect on us as people and how we speak. And so that makes everything a lot more continuous than perhaps it previously was. In speaking on class, the paper brings up everybody's favourite babe, Karl Marx. So for Marx and his general theory is the idea of conflict between different classes. The idea that different classes are in disparity or unmergeable, which to a certain extent, and I feel that now in our contemporary society, this unmergeability, if that be a word, is not as stark because of things like the internet. However, it still stands. There is definitely class disparity, and that is an unarguable point. The concept of those who have and those who do not, the capitalist bourgeoisie versus the worker. And while this episode is not on class, it is on language, we cannot deny the partition between the haves and the have-nots. And I shall leave that there for today. In language, and language differences between different classes, there is a non-economic social superstructure. So people at the top speak a particular way and people at the bottom speak a different particular way, all ranging across the same language if phrases and wording be different. The sounds, and a point that I found really intriguing and I really wanted to talk about in this paper, in the podcast episode, was about the fact that the sounds and the signs that people make, so the signs in the way of their facial expressions, their gesticulations as they talk, these straddle the entirety of humanity. And even, you could say, even apes, they gesticulate. And it's interesting to think of the non-verbal ways in which we communicate versus the verbal ways, and how graded one is in the respect of superior to inferior versus how universal the other is. But I digress. Sounds and signs have no intrinsic relationship to class. They transcend, they diffuse, and they are not ranked. The social evaluation of language differences, however, depends directly on the differences of power, status, and class between people. So this goes back to the idea of class determining the way you speak versus the way you speak determining class. The idea that language differences are defined by your class because that is the environment in which you grew up, but it also is then intrinsically linked with power and status, because class is ultimately linked with status, definitely, and power within that, whether that be that somebody earns more money, or whether that be they own more, or anything like this. Because this links into the different subgroups. So somebody could be upper class, but they could be new or old money in the sort of traditional terms or the older terms. Somebody could be a white collar worker, or they could have been born into wealth. So there are differences there, especially with the modern sort of uprising of the new versus old money debate, and the idea that old money are now becoming quite disenfranchised with this new money idea, and they want to separate themselves from it as far as possible, sort of indulging in this elegant, almost righteous aesthetic. And speech is another way in which one can separate themselves, because while speech is an inherent part of who we are as people, a fundamental part of who we are as we grow, speech is also something that can be doctored. You can deny the way in which others speak, or you can protect your own circle's way of speaking. You can deny the bringing in or the acceptance of things like, sort of, or but yeah. You can push those away to maintain the purity of your way of speaking or your class. Perhaps the way of speaking is a symptom rather than a cause of a greater issue, of a greater belief system, of a greater metric. We shall see. I am saying words. But yes, the idea that a particular way of speaking, this links back to the standardization of English, is inherently good. It's because it's the social dialect of the dominant classes. The dominant classes do not necessarily mean the classes with the most people. The dominant classes mean the classes with the most influence, the most power. Wielded as it may be. Now, another quote, I didn't want to name it. I didn't want to name the episode after this or say the episode was inspired by this quote. However, I did want to raise it. So, this was a very interesting paper. And a lot of things said, and it made me think, and it's inspired a great mass of the content of this episode and this conversation, which is wonderful. However, there were certain phrases that perhaps written down didn't look the most amiable. The frequent use of peasants. Not entirely sure about that one. Every time I saw peasants, it kind of just slowly chipped away at my patience. But also this quote. Bankers don't sound like busboys. Professors don't sound like plumbers. There's such bias and condescension in that, just saying something like that. I know it sounds nice because of the alliterative B's and P's. However, there is an inherent bias in the structuring of that sentence and an inherent bias in the way in which one reads it as well, to be fair, because they can be stating a fact. I interpret it as they're discriminating against the plumbers and the busboys. But why should they be discriminating against the plumbers and the busboys? Why should they be condescending them? Maybe they're not. Maybe they're just stating fact. But how it's structured seems suspicious. But there's my own thoughts in there as well. And maybe my second thought is challenging. My second thought now, as I'm speaking, is challenging my first thought, as Khadijah says, for us to do. But yes, it was interesting how professors and bankers is placed first in the sentence versus plumbers and busboys. I'll just let that one sizzle. I'll let it sizzle. And now we get to the quotes that have inspired the episode. Language is a social product and social tool, which it is, because language is both and the diversity in language is both as I said, a symptom and a cause of social fractionation. And in the same way that language can also be used, you can manipulate your own language to land a job. You can manipulate your own language to gain access to a different class or a different room. Get your foot in the door, you know? Gain access to a different societal group. Maybe you acquire the language of a certain group. It may not be the classical upper white way of speaking, but it may be a way of speaking that allows you to enter into a certain group. It allows you to make friends. It allows you to be a certain way. And there are large scale things such as perhaps trying to convince a certain generation that you would be the next best thing for them, whether it's a world leader or a writer or anything like that, or whether, or a musician, or whether it's using a particular way of speaking because these are particular phrases that a group of people use, that you're in high school and you think, you know, they look quite a nice group, or oh, they're quite popular, so if I start speaking like them, then maybe I'll be popular too. You know, there's all these different layers, and it's a very complex question. But going back to Marx, there is a clear link to politics in the way people speak. So it was very, very interesting because from a study and from an assessment of people's language, the idea that the workers or the working class, they have a supervised routine and they are all together generally. This engenders class consciousness in them and gives them an ideology of solidarity. This means that the class influences their beliefs and the surroundings, of course, by where they're born, influence those beliefs too. And it's a very, very complex question because the idea that the workers are together, they have that solidarity, and so in the way they speak there is a solidarity. One can identify another person of working class if they themselves are working class more clearly than the case otherwise. And there is a sense of understanding in that. Even the way you speak, so the way you present yourself is obviously the first thing that people see. But the way you speak is one of the subsequent things that people know about you, and they can infer things from that, whether those inferences be accurate or not, or biased or not. But if one working class person speaks to another, per se, and this is very generic, but you can gain a sense of understanding of each other that can be unspoken, because you can tell from your voices that you're potentially of a similar background, in the same set, or the way in which you speak, rather. In the same sense that hearing an accent, you know, if I hear another northern accent, or if somebody hears my voice and they are also northern, there is instantly that sense of connection and a sense of experience and layers to a person and one's personhood that one can understand instantly just from hearing a few words. It's very deep and very complex, and there's definitely some psychological mumbo jumbo going on here. It's all very intriguing. I love the depth of human thought. It's very fun. We love debates. But going back to the question, the middle classes, there is more autonomy in the workplace. There is more relative isolation. And this ultimately leads them to perhaps more conservative beliefs. So this is really interesting because this is the idea that one's class, the environment in which they're brought up, and therefore how their language changes, this influences their beliefs in the way that maybe something like the Conservative Party or Conservative parties in general, if we're speaking worldly wise, they use this particular language. And so it goes in a circle of somebody identifying with that particular party or with a certain group's beliefs. And because you then identify with that, people grow up, the turnover occurs when new people come into the group, but they've been brought up around the very foundations of that group and the underlying messages and the underlying values of that group. So they reinforce that way of speaking, and then new children are born and they are then infused, or they then grow up around those particular beliefs and around that way of speaking and that language, and therefore that then influences them towards that party as well because they see themselves in it. It's very interesting, and it definitely links the fact of, say, certain areas, say for the UK and in general elections, certain areas tend to be a particular way. They tend to lean a particular way, whereas other areas tend to lean another particular way. And there's that history of having certain beliefs, of being a certain class, of certain ways of speaking and use of language and interpretation and discussion, and maybe a particular community is a lot more open about their values, whereas another particular community very closed off, and so it's all very isolating. And all of these different complexities, as well as descendancy, influence the way that one votes, conducts themselves, makes choices, what they do for a living, their personality as a whole. It's very, very interesting. And this sort of goes into the genetics versus, what's the phrase? It's like your genes versus your upbringing, and which one's more influential in general in making you as a person. But we'll see. I think there's a northern gene out there. I'm waiting to find it. But tell you, there's a northern gene. Strong and true-blooded. Okay. So an interesting point the paper raises as well is I've been talking a lot about the global north. I've been talking a lot about countries that are quote unquote rich, higher wealth in general, higher average GDP, all this sort of thing. Now, the paper goes on to consider the global south. I know global north and global south are very overarching terms, but just for sake of ease. So the global south, or communities where there has been lower economic growth or prospect. The vast urbanisation of certain countries, whether it's by imperial influence or not, so that is another question, another debate, which in fact does also link to language, which we'll come on to in a minute. Vast urbanisation, when those particular communities that were so isolated, that brings together a lot of dialects and ultimately creates that more blended structure of language. Perhaps groups pick up things from other groups, and then that ultimately creates an almost a new dialect. And that's very, very interesting to look at and also to study. So let's talk about colonialism. It's funny because in the paper, so colonialism, I just wrote boo. So in colonialism, the ruling classes place language onto the indigenous peoples, and that... Okay. So in building a colony, the ruling classes, ergo the colonizer, places language onto the colonized peoples, and they begin to, as was the case, sort countries or regions into particular sectors. This is very unnatural to the natural movement of people, and thus the language conventions. So one may freely travel from one place to the other in their natural state, but as soon as a colonizer, in the general sense of the term, and the colonizer being the group, comes along and splits your country up, infuses your country with their own beliefs, forces their own beliefs on you, their religion, because language and religion are very closely linked as well, particular phrasing, particular ways of expressing oneself. And they almost attempt to enforce their own standardization and therefore dilute your dialects and your accents. This reduces the richness of a culture, or attempts to reduce the richness of a culture, and leads to mass loss of even language itself. Because we can talk about English dialects, but we can also talk about actual languages that were eradicated due to the forced introduction of English. The standardization of English goes beyond the actual language itself, when English becomes a standard that one must speak because they have been colonized. There's a general shift or large-scale change towards this European standard, and it's going to be extremely damaging. the paper brings up pidgin languages as well. So this officially is a version of a language with grammatical error. What comes under pidgin English can be varying, subjective even. But there is this concept of it being lesser. But a pidgin language, and whenever I say pidgin, I'm making quotation marks with my hands and with my fingers because, yes, it's the concept of a pidgin language being completely ungrammatical and almost, uneducated, or the wrong version, or getting the standard. I mean, it's getting the language wrong is essentially the idea that's attached to it. It has a total lack of concept for language itself, and a total lack of appreciation for what language is, which is a tool of communication and community. Language is not something to rate people by. Language is not something to, achieve. It's not a ranking system. Language is a beautiful conception of the human brain. Language and the formation of words in our very mouths is human nature and is something that separates us from the other animals on this earth. It allows us to communicate. It allows us to create beautiful things and discuss and change things, and it allows us to be human. And so by degrading a particular way of talking, is that not degrading one's ability to communicate and therefore one's capacity to be human? Is saying that somebody's language is a pidgin version when you can very well understand them, or even attempt to understand them? If you're attempting to speak a language that is not your first language, for example, somebody learning French or Italian or Korean, and you're attempting to speak to somebody, or vice versa, and somebody's attempting to speak English, there is a beauty in its very nature of somebody attempting to communicate with you and making that effort, and the richness that you can gain from speaking to people from all different backgrounds and all different ways of speaking. And maybe there are things you don't quite get, maybe you don't quite hear somebody's accent, but you try and you can reach a common ground and understanding without having to degrade the way in which somebody speaks because it's not standard, because it's not the norm. You can gain that sense of community and familiarity with the people that speak the same as you. And that's wonderful in itself, because that's necessary for somebody to feel belonging or certainty, to know where you sit in the world. There's also such a richness and variety. And maybe we should open ourselves up more to what else is out there, instead of telling people that they're not intelligent because they don't phrase something in a particular way, or they don't enunciate their T's. There are a lot of differences between the ways men and women speak, because a lot of the facets of language are tightly linked to gender. So it's intriguing to see how ingrained these potentially can become. The idea of the phone thing that I mentioned earlier. But also with children versus adults. Of course, they're going to speak differently, but also children have less inhibitions. Children don't worry as much, perhaps, until they reach a certain age about how they speak, because they're just communicating. They don't even think about it. Whereas adults may change how they speak. They think more carefully about what they're going to say in the first place. You can make the conscious decision to say not swear, and then children acquire swear words depending on their environment. But it's intriguing how our own language can change over time, moving with the times, with acquiring new terms for particular arguments, or just acquiring more, say, vocabulary as you go through the education system. It depends where you go, if you go to university or if you get a job. Your line of work, that's going to influence the words you use, who you're around, what sort of people you identify with. Different ways of speaking and language variation as a whole penetrates multiple layers of society. Class itself is a murky scale. It's based on income, on education level, on occupation, but it's skewed between men and women. And similarly to ethnicity as well, it's highly skewed because historically women and people of colour have not had the opportunities that white men have had. I say historically. And so this skews the class they belong to put it in very blunt terms, because their income is stunted or their access to education, be it further education or basic education, is stunted, because the occupations that they're given access to are stunted, and this therefore stunts their ability to access a higher class, or ultimately just places them in a particular class that perhaps isn't even relevant to them. So an example was used where a husband and wife, the wife earns less, and so on her own she would be in a given class, but then an entire family is given the ranking, in quotation marks, of the male. They're classed based on the male, the father, the husband. And it's very intriguing, because also you could take this the other way around and say, well, what if the woman earns more? And that's why the designation of class is a very blurry and tricksy sort of thing. And also, just because one knows what the norm is or the standard is, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will automatically acquire it. This links back to the idea that I mentioned before about the working class, just by their way of life and then therefore the way they speak, having that feeling of solidarity, and the idea that due to this feeling of solidarity they're not going to waver from how they speak just because it may be the standard or it may be what's deemed as higher. They're going to speak how they speak because everyone around them and their community speaks that way. In a similar way, upper classes have been very defensive or resistant to change in order to maintain their social position. And so again, it's almost the treasuring of our language, the elitism, which links back to the idea of the high and low brow. The exclusivity of this higher brow art is the very thing that makes it highbrow. It's not the actual thing itself, it's the cost of an opera ticket. In this final little bit, this final little point, I just want to say how wonderful varied language is. The culture and the richness in all our different little phrases and all our different ways of talking. What we can understand about each other, or what we can get to know by asking each other about the origins of particular phrases, particular idioms. The desire to just learn about somebody else because maybe they speak differently and you want to find out a bit more about them. Don't be afraid to ask people questions. I think perhaps there are people who want to be asked. Perhaps there are people who want to talk about their history or their background or where they're from or their different experiences with people who haven't experienced that same thing. By talking to people about all their life, by talking to people about their life, you gain such a wider understanding of humanity as a whole. You gain a story of a life that you've never lived. You gain a story of a life that is completely outside of yours and your friends and your networks. And it's so wonderful. A mutual connection, a mutuality, be it interest, you both like football, or you're both following a particular creator online, that gives you that springboard to diversify, to find a respect and a newfound joy and an intrigue and a knowledge in what other people's lives are like and other people's experiences. Language is wonderful because it shows who we are without having to talk itself. Language and how we speak conveys who we are through our ideas just by saying hello. And the way we speak also may not necessarily reflect what our supposed ideas are. Our accent, our dialect, our language itself in the English to German to Cantonese spectrum. Our language is deeply infused with our experiences, and our voices don't necessarily reflect who we are as people either. So there are a lot of stereotypes out there. But by having your certain way of speaking, maybe it's not standard, but you get a solidarity from that, like the working class thing, and your local culture, and there's a pride to that, perhaps. And in that way, particular phrases that linked to LGBTQ plus culture and pride in that way. There are particular phrases that are used now in a lot of popular culture. So there is obviously that tricky layer of it's been perhaps taken advantage of in a way, and that it's wonderful to see more openness to queerness in society as a whole. But perhaps there is a stereotype now instilled The idea that now people feel that they have to speak a certain way as queer to be accepted as queer. So is it the way to gain access to things because people want the fun queer guy? It's the same with use of a lot of phrases that originated in black culture. They've been taken into the general, sort of a more general, overarching way of speaking, especially in the younger generations. And while this richness is wonderful, you've also got to be careful of the appropriation. And this is a tricky and blurry line to talk on, especially as a white woman. And so I can't speak from a personal point of view of feeling any particular way about the use of a lot of phrases that originated in black culture in wider society. Maybe somebody out there can share some opinions on that. The idea of generational differences as well. There are massive generational differences. I feel that potentially there is less pressure now to speak a certain way than there was, say, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. I think generationally we've become more generally accepting of different cultures, which is absolutely wonderful. And this is coming from Western society, but obviously things are different all across the world. And so we can't take our standard to be the standard of elsewhere. But they were all my notes. I've covered a few different things in this, and I think there are definitely places where there are thoughts unfinished. I think there are places where we could definitely expand on certain questions. If there are any particular things that I said that maybe you want to hear a bit more on or want to start a conversation about, please comment, please message me. I'd love to really discuss things. I might even start one of the message channels to just discuss some ideas a bit more and see what you guys think. I'd love to get some listener sort of quotes in some of my episodes, and we'll do some more interviews soon. So watch your inbox. I might be messaging you. The people I've already asked about doing interviews, you know who you are. And thank you all so much for listening. I hope I haven't forgotten anything, because I feel like I'm sort of cutting this. I normally have a whole outro section that I record separately, so this is rogue. But yeah, thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope to hear you next time. I hope you hear me next time. I hope to see you next time. Take care. Let's keep talking.